The cowboy threw himself between Alina and the arrows without thought. Two wooden shafts pierced his shoulder and arm as he hit the desert ground hard. Dust clouds swirled around the overturned wagon where Alina Blackwell crouched, her dark hands steady on her rifle despite the chaos. The Comanche warriors whooped from the ridge above, their painted faces fierce in the afternoon sun. Alina's shots were precise, calculated. Each bullet found its mark, sending the attackers retreating into the canyon shadows. The desert fell silent except for the wounded stranger's labored breathing. She kept her weapon trained on the rocks above, waiting, listening. The wind carried nothing but sage and dust. The cowboy lay motionless beside the wagon wheel, blood seeping into the dry earth beneath him. His hat had tumbled away, revealing sandy hair and a face weathered by too many seasons under an unforgiving sky. Alina had never seen him before, yet something about his features stirred a memory she couldn't place. Minutes crawled by, no movement from the ridge. The Comanche were gone, but they would return with reinforcements before nightfall. Alina lowered her rifle and knelt beside the stranger. His breathing was shallow but steady. The arrows had struck flesh, not organs. She examined the wooden shafts. Comanche craftsmanship, but the paint markings were wrong. These warriors belonged to no tribe she recognized. The realization settled in her stomach like cold stone. This attack had been deliberate, planned. The cowboy's eyes fluttered open, blue as winter sky. He focused on her face with effort. "Your father," he whispered through cracked lips. He was right about the eye. Alina's blood turned to ice. Nobody knew about the eye. She had never spoken of it to another living soul. The leather cord around her neck suddenly felt heavy as chains. The small carved stone hidden beneath her shirt seemed to burn against her skin. "Who are you?" Her voice came out harder than intended. The stranger tried to sit up and winced. "Name's Silas Callahan, dusty to most folks." His gaze drifted to her throat where the cord disappeared beneath her collar. "That's Wyoming's eye you're wearing, isn't it?" Alina's hand moved instinctively to cover the hidden amulet. Her mother had pressed it into her palm the night before she died. Her father had never explained its significance, only that it must never leave her possession. Now this bleeding stranger spoke of it like an old acquaintance. "My father's been dead 3 years." The words came out flat, emotionless. She had perfected that tone during countless nights when grief threatened to consume her. "Whatever you think you know about him, you're mistaken." Silas studied her face with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "Marcus Blackwell, finest trader on the frontier until Jeremiah Cortez put a bullet in his back." The name hit Alina like a physical blow. Cortez. She had searched for that name in every saloon, every trading post, every dusty settlement between Kansas and California. Marcus Blackwell had died in what the territorial marshal called a robbery gone wrong. No suspects, no leads, case closed. But this stranger knew different. Alina grabbed Silas by his good shoulder. "How do you know about Cortez?" "Because I was there." His voice was growing weaker. "Your father and I were partners, business partners." He coughed, spitting dust and blood. "There's things you need to know. Things about why they killed him." The desert wind picked up, scattering tumbleweeds across the broken landscape. Alina scanned the ridgeline again. Empty, but they would return. They always returned. She made her decision with the same cold calculation she used for everything else in her life. This stranger had saved her from certain death. That created a debt. More importantly, he possessed knowledge she had spent 3 years seeking. Alina slipped her arms under his shoulders and began dragging him toward a cluster of red rocks 50 yards away. She had spotted the cave entrance during the initial attack. Shallow, but defensible, hidden from casual observation. Silas groaned but didn't protest. His boots carved furrows in the sand as she pulled him across the open ground. Each step felt exposed, vulnerable. The arrows protruding from his shoulder made the task awkward, but Alina had moved wounded men before. Her years as a bounty hunter had taught her many unpleasant skills. The cave mouth was barely wide enough for two people. Ancient water had carved the hollow from solid stone, leaving smooth walls that stayed cool even in desert heat. Alina eased Silas against the back wall and checked his wounds in the dim light. The arrows needed to come out, but not here, not without proper supplies. She broke off the protruding shafts as close to his skin as possible, then used strips torn from her spare shirt to bind the wounds. Basic field medicine, it would have to suffice. Silas watched her work with fevered eyes. "You learned this from your father. I learned this staying alive." Alina finished tying the last bandage. "Something Marcus Blackwell never taught me how to do. He tried to protect you from his world, tried to keep you safe." Silas reached into his vest pocket with his good hand. "But some things can't stay buried forever." He pulled out a faded photograph, its edges worn soft from handling. Alina took it with trembling fingers. 3 people stood beside a loaded freight wagon. Her father looked younger, his face unmarked by the worry lines she remembered. Silas appeared perhaps 20 years old, wearing a clean shirt and an optimistic smile. Between them stood a woman Alina had never seen before. The photograph raised more questions than it answered, but one thing was certain. This meeting in the desert was no coincidence. The stranger bleeding in her makeshift sanctuary possessed secrets that could finally explain her father's death. Outside the cave, shadows were growing longer. Night would bring temporary safety from the Comanche, but it would also bring the cold. Alina settled against the cave wall and studied the mysterious photograph while Silas drifted in and out of consciousness. Tomorrow she would demand answers. Tonight she would keep them both alive. The wind whistled through the cave entrance, carrying the scent of distant rain. Alina clutched the photograph and waited for dawn. Dawn came slowly to the desert cave, painting the stone walls in shades of amber and rust. Alina had kept watch through the long night, her rifle across her knees, listening to every wind-carried sound. Silas stirred as the first light touched his face. His fever had broken sometime before sunrise. The makeshift bandages were stained dark, but the bleeding had stopped. Alina had seen men die from lesser wounds and others survive worse. This cowboy carried the stubborn vitality of someone who refused to quit. She held up the photograph. "Tell me about the woman." Silas struggled to sit upright, his back against the cave wall. His eyes found the image and something shifted in his expression. Pain that had nothing to do with arrow wounds. "That's Sarah Brennan. She was going to be my wife." His voice carried the weight of old grief. "Before Cortez killed her too." Alina studied the woman's face in the faded photograph. Young, pretty in the way frontier women learn to be, with strength beneath the softness. Sarah stood between Marcus and Silas with the easy comfort of someone who belonged. "She worked for your father, kept the books for Blackwell Trading Company." Silas accepted the photograph when Alina handed it back. "Smartest person any of us ever met. She's the one who figured out what Cortez was really doing." The morning light revealed details Alina had missed in the darkness. Silas wore no wedding ring, but his vest pocket held the permanent outline of something small and rectangular. The photograph had been carried there for years. "Your father hired me straight off a cattle drive. Green as spring grass and twice as useless." Silas tucked the image back into his vest. "Marcus saw something in me I didn't see in myself, gave me purpose." Alina poured water from her canteen onto a clean cloth and handed it to him. Silas drank first, then used the damp fabric to clean dust from his face. The simple act revealed character. A selfish man would have kept the water for himself. "Blackwell Trading Company was legitimate. We moved goods between settlements, helped folks get what they needed to survive out here." Silas paused, studying Alina's face. "Your father believed in building something instead of just taking." The words stirred memories Alina had tried to bury. Marcus Blackwell coming home with stories of families he had helped. Settlers who had survived their first winter because of supplies he delivered. Children who learned to read from books he carried across hundreds of miles of empty land. Cortez was our third partner, provided the initial investment, handled connections with the territorial government. Silas shifted against the stone wall, favoring his wounded shoulder. We thought we knew him. Alina had heard that name whispered in saloons and trading posts. Jeremiah Cortez, a man who moved in shadows, building wealth through methods honest folks didn't question too closely. The territorial government considered him a respectable businessman. Sarah noticed the discrepancies first: shipments that didn't match our records, payments for goods we never ordered. Silas stared at his hands, calloused from years of honest work. She started keeping a second set of books, secret ones. The cave felt smaller suddenly. Alina realized she was holding her breath. Cortez was using our company as cover, moving weapons to hostile tribes, then selling information about their attacks to the settlements they raided. The words came out flat, emotionless. He was profiting from both sides of every conflict. Alina's world tilted. Her mother had died in a Comanche raid when Alina was 15. Her father had told her it was the random violence of frontier life. Senseless, unavoidable. But what if it wasn't random at all? Marcus wanted to expose him, take the evidence to the territorial marshal, shut down the whole operation. Silas looked up at Alina. Cortez found out what we knew. The desert wind whistled through the cave entrance, carrying the scent of sage and distant storms. Alina felt something cold settling in her chest, the weight of understanding. He killed them both, made it look like a robbery. Alina's voice came out steady despite the earthquake happening inside her chest. Sarah first, then your father when he tried to reach the marshal's office. Silas touched his vest pocket where the photograph rested. I was supposed to die that night too. Pure luck I was out on a supply run. Alina stood and walked to the cave entrance. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions, broken only by distant mesas and the scattered bones of long-dead trees. Empty, hostile, beautiful in its indifference to human suffering. Her father hadn't died in a random robbery. He had died trying to stop a man who fed on conflict and bloodshed. The realization should have brought clarity, but instead it raised new questions. Why didn't you go to the authorities? Tell them what really happened. With what proof? Sarah's secret books died with her. The evidence was destroyed. Silas attempted to stand and winced. Besides, Cortez owns half the territorial government. His word against a broken-down cowboy who couldn't even protect his own woman. Alina turned back to face him. But you kept looking for evidence. For 3 years, following rumors, tracking his operations, building a case piece by piece. Silas met her eyes. Until yesterday, when I realized what your father gave you before he died. Alina's hand moved instinctively to the leather cord around her neck. Wyoming's eye, the carved stone her mother had called a family heirloom. Her father had never explained its significance, only insisted she wear it always. It's not a trinket, is it? Your father was smarter than any of us knew. He encoded everything into that stone. Sarah's records, Cortez's transactions, locations of weapon caches. Silas leaned forward. Wyoming's eye is a map, a key to everything Cortez has been hiding. The weight around Alina's neck suddenly felt immense. She had carried her father's legacy without knowing it. 3 years of hunting bounties and chasing ghosts while the answers hung against her heart. Cortez knows you have it. That's why he sent those Comanche yesterday. That's why he's been spreading word that you're the one selling weapons to the tribes. Silas struggled to his feet. He's using your father's death as cover for his own crimes. Alina pulled the stone from beneath her shirt. Wyoming's eye was no bigger than a silver dollar, carved from some dark mineral she couldn't identify. Symbols covered its surface in intricate patterns that looked random to casual observation. But now she knew better. The symbols were code. Her father's final message. He framed me. The words tasted bitter. Made me the villain in his story. The territorial government has a warrant for your arrest. Jeremiah Cortez is considered a reliable witness. Silas joined her at the cave entrance. As far as they know, Alina Blackwell is a dangerous criminal who needs to be stopped. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the cool shadows that had sheltered them through the night. Soon the desert would become an oven. They needed to move. Alina studied the carved stone in her palm, her father's legacy, her mother's death, 3 years of living as a bounty hunter while carrying the proof of her own innocence. "Can you ride?" Silas tested his wounded arm. Pain flickered across his face, but he nodded. "Where are we going?" Alina tucked Wyoming's eye back beneath her shirt and shouldered her rifle. The weight felt familiar, comforting. She had spent 3 years learning to survive in a world that wanted her dead. Now she knew why. Rusted Gulch. If Cortez wants people to believe I'm a criminal, we'll give him the chance to prove it. She stepped out of the cave into the blazing morning light. Time to clear my father's name. The desert wind carried dust and the promise of storms. Alina walked toward their hidden horses, her shadow long and dark against the red earth. Behind her, Silas followed without question. The photograph in his vest pocket held the faces of 2 dead friends, but the woman walking ahead of him carried something more valuable than memory. She carried the truth. Rusted Gulch appeared on the horizon at midday, wavering in the heat like a mirage. Alina had brought in 3 bounties to this town over the past year. The saloon keeper knew her name. The general store owner trusted her coin. Children waved from doorways when she rode through. Now her face stared back at her from wanted posters nailed to every post and building. Alina Blackwell, dangerous arms dealer, $500 reward. The sketch artist had captured her features with unsettling accuracy. High cheekbones, steady eyes, the kind of face people remembered. Below her portrait, smaller text detailed her alleged crimes: selling weapons to hostile tribes, inciting violence against peaceful settlements, armed and extremely dangerous. Silas pulled his hat low and adjusted his position in the saddle. The arrow wounds made riding painful, but he endured without complaint. 3 days in the desert had taught Alina to respect his quiet toughness. Half the town's probably armed and waiting. Alina studied the dusty main street from their position behind a cluster of weathered rocks. $500 is more money than most folks see in a year. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had become the bounty everyone else would hunt. They waited as the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, watching, learning the rhythms of the town. Alina counted 6 men loitering near the saloon who didn't belong, strangers with the hard eyes and careful postures of hired guns. Cortez has been busy. Silas followed her gaze. Those aren't local boys. Sheriff Buck Morrison emerged from his office and surveyed the street with the casual authority of a man comfortable in his power. Alina had dealt with Morrison before. He seemed honest enough for frontier law, though that wasn't saying much. Morrison spoke briefly with 2 of the hired guns, then disappeared back into his office. The exchange lasted only seconds, but Alina caught the subtle nod. The passing of folded paper, the sheriff's bought. The realization settled in her stomach, cold and heavy. Cortez owns the whole town. They had ridden into a trap with their eyes wide open. Every face on the street was a potential enemy. Every building could hide an ambush. Alina felt the familiar weight of Wyoming's eye against her chest, the burden of truth in a world built on lies. "We could ride around. Find another way to clear your name." Silas shifted his wounded shoulder and winced. "This doesn't have to end here." Alina studied his face. 3 days of desert sun had darkened his skin and deepened the lines around his eyes. He carried his pain without complaint, but she saw how each movement cost him. He would follow her anywhere. The knowledge brought unexpected warmth to her chest. No more running. Alina checked her rifle and pistol. Both weapons were clean, oiled ready. "My father never got the chance to face his accusers. I will." They rode into Rusted Gulch at sunset when the failing light would make them harder targets. Alina kept her head high despite the wanted posters bearing her likeness. Let them see her face. Let them know she wasn't hiding. The town fell silent as they passed. Women pulled children indoors. Men stepped back into shadows. Only the hired guns remained visible, hands resting casually near their weapons. Alina dismounted in front of the Dusty Rose Saloon, the same establishment where she had shared drinks with settlers grateful for her protection. where children had pressed their faces against windows to watch the famous lady bounty hunter. Now those same windows reflected only suspicion and fear. The saloon doors swung open before a leaner could reach them. Sheriff Morrison stepped onto the wooden sidewalk, his badge catching the last rays of sunlight. Two deputies flanked him, their rifles held with nervous tension. "Leaner Blackwell, you're under arrest for trafficking weapons to hostile tribes." Morrison's voice carried across the silent street, loud enough for every witness to hear. Official, legal, the proper words spoken in the proper way. Leaner stopped 10 feet from the sheriff, close enough to read the guilt in his eyes, far enough to draw her weapon if necessary. "Funny thing about those charges, Buck. I've been hunting the real arms dealer for 3 years." She let her gaze sweep the street, taking in all the watching faces. "Turns out he's been hiding behind my father's grave." Morrison's hand moved closer to his pistol. "You've got a choice, Leaner. Come quietly or face the consequences." "The way my father faced them. Shot in the back like a rabid dog." The sheriff's face flushed red. Anger or shame, Leaner couldn't tell which. Behind him, the hired guns began spreading out to better angles, professional, patient. They had done this before. Silas dismounted slowly, favoring his wounded side. The movement drew attention from several of the gunmen. Leaner saw their eyes calculate distances, angles, threat levels. "This is Leaner Blackwell," Morrison announced to the gathering crowd. "Wanted for crimes against the territory. Anyone who aids her will be considered an accomplice." The words had their intended effect. The few remaining townspeople melted away into buildings and alleyways. Leaner stood alone in the center of the dusty street, abandoned by people she had once protected. Only Silas remained at her side. Morrison pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket. The same paper Leaner had seen him accept from the hired gun. "I've got a signed confession here. Witness testimony placing you at the scene of 3 separate weapons transactions." "Whose testimony?" "Jeremiah Cortez, respected businessman and territorial advisor." Morrison's voice grew stronger as he recited the official line. "He's been tracking your activities for months, building a case." Leaner felt laughter bubble up from somewhere deep in her chest, but it came out bitter and sharp. "Cortez is the one selling weapons. He killed my father to cover his tracks." "You got any proof of that?" The challenge hung in the air between them. Leaner's hand moved unconsciously to the leather cord around her neck. Wyoming's eye pressed against her palm through the fabric of her shirt. She had proof. Her father's final gift. 3 years of encoded evidence that could destroy Cortez and clear her name. But not here. Not surrounded by bought lawmen and hired killers. The moment she revealed the stone's true nature, she would become even more valuable dead than alive. "Proof has a way of disappearing in this territory," Leaner said instead. "Especially when it threatens the wrong people." Morrison stepped closer. His deputies raised their rifles. The hired guns continued their slow encirclement. Leaner counted 8 men total, all armed, all committed to taking her alive or dead. The mathematics of survival were simple. She and Silas were outnumbered 4-1. The townspeople had abandoned them. The law itself had been corrupted. Leaner had faced worse odds, but never with so much at stake. Silas moved closer to her side, not touching but close enough that she felt his presence, steady, unafraid, ready to face whatever came next. "Last chance, Leaner." Morrison drew his pistol but kept it pointed at the ground. "Surrender now and you'll get a fair trial." "The same fair trial my father got." Morrison's face went stone cold. "Your father was a criminal who got what he deserved." The words hit Leaner harder than any physical blow. Her vision tunneled. Her hand found her pistol grip without conscious thought, but before she could draw, Silas stepped forward. "Sheriff Morrison." His voice carried a strange authority Leaner hadn't heard before. "Before you make any arrests, you might want to see my credentials." Silas reached slowly into his vest pocket. Morrison tensed, his weapon rising slightly. The hired guns shifted positions, fingers tightening on triggers. Instead of a weapon, Silas produced a small leather folder. He flipped it open to reveal a silver badge and official papers. United States Marshal Silas Callahan and Alina Blackwell is under federal protection. The street erupted into chaos as Morrison's carefully laid trap crumbled around him. The sheriff's face went white. The hired guns looked uncertainly between their local authority and federal law. Alina stared at Silas in shock. 3 days of shared danger and growing trust, and he had never mentioned being a lawman. The weight of betrayal settled in her chest heavy and cold. Morrison recovered first, his politician's instincts taking over. "I'll need to verify those credentials with your superior, Marshal." Silas nodded calmly. "Commander Hayes at Fort Esperanza. Send a telegraph." Alina watched the exchange with growing confusion. Federal Marshal, official protection. None of it made sense with what Silas had told her about being her father's business partner, unless everything he had told her was a lie. The telegraph to Fort Esperanza took 2 hours to receive a reply. Alina spent the time in Morrison's jail cell, staring through iron bars at the man who had saved her life 3 times in 4 days. Silas sat on a wooden chair outside her cell, his marshal's badge now pinned openly to his vest. Everything she thought she knew had crumbled to dust. How much of it was true? Alina's voice echoed off the stone walls. "The trading company, Sarah, my father." Silas studied his hands, calloused from years of hard work, but now she wondered what kind of work. Marshalling was a different trade than freight hauling. All of it. Every word. He looked up and met her eyes. "I just left out the part about working for the federal government." The jail cell felt smaller than the desert cave. At least there she had been free to leave. Here, iron bars and legal authority held her prisoner while hired guns waited outside for their next opportunity. "Marcus was my informant. Had been for 2 years before Cortez killed him." Silas adjusted his wounded shoulder. The arrow injuries were healing, but slowly. The federal government suspected weapons were being sold to hostile tribes. We needed someone on the inside. Alina gripped the cell bars, cold metal against her palms. "So my father was a spy. Your father was a patriot. He risked everything to stop men who profited from frontier violence." Silas stood and approached the cell. "When he died, I promised I would finish what he started." Morrison returned from the telegraph office with a grim expression. The federal response had clearly not been what he hoped for. Alina watched him read the message twice before folding it carefully and placing it in his vest pocket. "Marshal Callahan's credentials check out." Morrison unlocked Alina's cell with obvious reluctance. "You're free to go, Miss Blackwell, under federal protection." Alina stepped into the main office but didn't feel free. Too many questions remained unanswered. Too many pieces of the puzzle were still missing. What about the charges, the wanted posters? "Territorial matters are superseded by federal authority." Morrison's words came out clipped, professional. "The posters will be removed." Alina studied the sheriff's face. Fear flickered behind his eyes, not fear of her but of something larger, someone with more power than a small-town badge could protect against. "We need horses and supplies for the ride to Fort Esperanza." Silas collected his hat from Morrison's desk. "The territorial government will want a full report." Morrison nodded too quickly, eager to be rid of them both. "Take whatever you need from my personal stable. Consider it a gesture of cooperation." They walked out of the jail into late afternoon heat. The hired guns had disappeared, melted away once federal authority asserted itself. Alina felt their absence more than their presence. Predators didn't abandon hunting grounds without good reason. The horses Morrison provided were quality animals, well-fed, properly shod, bred for desert travel. Alina ran her hands along her mount's neck, checking for soundness out of habit. "You still don't trust me." Silas secured their water and supplies with practiced efficiency. Alina swung into her saddle. The leather creaked under her weight, a sound she had learned to associate with freedom, movement, the ability to ride away from trouble. "I trusted my father. Look how that ended." They rode out of Rusted Gulch as the sun touched the western mountains. Alina didn't look back, but she felt the town's eyes following them. Some hostile, some relieved, all calculating what her survival might mean for their own futures. The desert opened before them, endless and indifferent. Alina had spent 3 years learning its moods and dangers. Now she rode beside a man who claimed to be her ally, but had lied about his most basic identity. "Tell me about Commander Hayes." Silas guided his horse around a cluster of barrel cactus. "Good man, honest, been fighting corruption in the territorial government for 5 years. And he'll clear my name. He'll present the evidence to the right people. Make sure justice gets done." Alina touched the leather cord around her neck. Wyoming's eye pressed against her chest, warm from her body heat. The proof her father had died to preserve. The key to everything Cortez had built on blood and lies. They made camp at sunset beside a shallow creek that would be dry by midsummer. Alina built a small fire while Silas tended the horses. Domestic tasks that created the illusion of normalcy, but nothing about their situation was normal. "Why didn't you tell me you were a marshal from the beginning?" Alina fed twigs to the growing flames. "In the cave when you were bleeding and half-conscious." Silas settled across the fire from her. The dancing light carved harsh shadows on his face. "Because there's a leak in the marshal's service. Someone's been feeding information to Cortez for months." The words hit Alina colder than desert night air. "You suspected me." "I suspected everyone. Your father's daughter, raised in isolation, making a living as a bounty hunter. It would have been perfect cover for an arms dealer." Alina stared into the fire. Mesquite wood burned clean and hot, crackling softly in the stillness. She had spent countless nights beside similar fires, always alone, always watching the darkness for threats. "When did you decide I wasn't the enemy?" "When you dragged me into that cave instead of leaving me for the Comanche. When you shared your water and tended my wounds." Silas poked at the fire with a stick. "Guilty people don't usually save the lives of federal marshals." The creek murmured nearby, its voice mixing with the night sounds of hunting owls and distant coyotes. Alina had learned to find comfort in such wilderness conversations. They meant she was far from the corruption and violence of civilization. "There's something else." Silas reached into his saddlebags and withdrew a leather portfolio. "I've been tracking Cortez's operations for 3 years. Building a case." He opened the portfolio to reveal maps, documents, witness statements. Years of careful investigation laid out in organized detail. Alina recognized some of the locations. Trading posts where she had stopped. Settlements where she had brought in bounties. He's been using the territorial mail system to coordinate with tribal leaders, selling them weapons, then selling information about their movements to the cavalry. Silas pointed to a series of connected dots on one map. "Every conflict has made him richer." Alina studied the evidence, meticulous, comprehensive, the kind of case that could bring down a territorial government. "But you're missing the most important piece." She pulled Wyoming's eye from beneath her shirt. "My father's records, the locations of weapon caches, financial transactions going back 5 years. Silas stared at the carved stone with obvious hunger. "Can you decode it?" "Some of it. Enough to know Cortez has a major cache hidden under the church in Rusted Gulch." Alina held the stone up to the firelight. "But there's more. Names, dates, amounts, everything needed to prosecute him." A coyote howled in the distance, its voice rising and falling in primal loneliness. Other coyotes answered until the desert rang with their wild chorus. Alina felt kinship with their isolation. "Fort Esperanza is 2 days' ride north." Silas closed his portfolio and secured it in his saddlebags. "Commander Hayes will have the resources to fully decode your father's message." Alina nodded but couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The hired guns had disappeared too easily. Morrison had capitulated too quickly. Cortez had spent 3 years building his criminal empire. He wouldn't abandon it without a fight. She banked the fire and rolled out her bedroll. The ground was hard but familiar. She had slept on worse and survived. Silas took first watch, his rifle across his knees as he scanned the darkness. Alina closed her eyes and tried to find sleep, but her mind kept circling back to the same troubling question. If Silas was really a federal marshal with evidence to prosecute Cortez, why had it taken 3 years to build his case? And why did she feel more trapped now than when she was locked in Morrison's jail cell? The night wind carried the scent of sage and distant storms. Alina pulled her blanket closer and tried to convince herself that tomorrow would bring answers instead of more questions. In the darkness beyond the dying fire, something moved through the shadows with predatory patience. Fort Esperanza rose from the desert floor ahead of them, its adobe walls baked the color of dried blood. Alina had seen the fort from a distance before but never approached its gates. Federal installations meant questions she preferred not to answer. Now she rode toward those same gates as a protected witness instead of a wanted fugitive. The transformation felt hollow. Silas presented his credentials to the guard at the main entrance. A young soldier with nervous eyes and sweaty palms examined the marshal's badge with the reverence of someone who had never seen federal authority up close. "Welcome to Fort Esperanza, Marshal Callahan. Commander Hayes is expecting you." They rode through the gates into a courtyard bustling with military activity. Soldiers drilled in formation, while others maintained weapons and equipment. The organized efficiency reminded Alina of her father's trading operation. Everyone knew their role. Everyone worked toward common purpose. But armies could serve corrupt masters as easily as honest ones. Commander Hayes met them at the stable. A tall man with gray hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent decades on the frontier. His uniform was clean but showed signs of field use, practical rather than ceremonial. "Marshal Callahan, good to see you alive." Hayes clasped Silas's hand with obvious relief. "We received word about the attack near Rusted Gulch." Alina dismounted and handed her reins to a waiting soldier. Hayes studied her with the careful attention of a career military officer accustomed to evaluating potential threats. "Miss Blackwell, your reputation precedes you." Hayes gestured toward the fort's main building. "We have much to discuss." They walked across the courtyard toward Hayes's office. Alina noted the placement of guards, the condition of weapons, the general state of readiness. Old habits from her bounty hunting days. Always know your environment. Always plan an escape route. Hayes's office was Spartan but comfortable. Maps covered the walls showing territorial boundaries, tribal territories, and trade routes. A large desk dominated the center of the room, its surface covered with reports and correspondence. "Please sit." Hayes indicated chairs arranged in front of his desk. "Marshal Callahan has kept me informed of your situation. I understand you possess evidence that could expose Jeremiah Cortez's criminal enterprise." Alina remained standing. The chair offered comfort but also constraint. She preferred to keep her options open. "Wyoming's Eye contains my father's records, financial transactions, weapon cache locations, correspondence with tribal leaders." Alina pulled the carved stone from beneath her shirt. Everything needed to prosecute Cortez and his associates. Hayes leaned forward with obvious interest. "May I examine it?" Alina hesitated. The stone had never left her possession since her mother's death. Trusting it to strangers felt wrong on some fundamental level, but Silas nodded encouragingly. "Commander Hayes has the resources to fully decode your father's message. Cryptographers, reference materials, time to do the work properly." Alina placed Wyoming's Eye on Hayes's desk. The commander picked it up carefully, turning it in the lamplight to examine the carved symbols. "Remarkable craftsmanship. Your father was more clever than anyone realized." Hayes set the stone down gently. "I'll have my best people work on this immediately." Something in his tone made Alina uncomfortable. Too eager, too hungry. She had seen that expression on men's faces before, usually when they were looking at something they intended to steal. "How long will the decoding take?" "Several days at minimum. Perhaps longer depending on the complexity of the cipher." Hayes stood and walked to a wall map. "In the meantime, you'll be our guests. safe within these walls while we build an ironclad case against Cortez. Alina studied the map Hayes was examining. Territorial boundaries marked in different colors, trade routes connecting settlements, strategic positions marked with military symbols, but also something else. Red pins clustered around certain locations, too many to be random, too organized to be coincidental. What do the red pins represent? Hayes glanced at the map, then back at Alina. Something flickered in his expression, surprise that she had noticed, calculation about how to respond. Recent tribal activity, raids, attacks on settlements, reports of weapon sightings. Hayes moved to block her view of the map. Intelligence gathering is an ongoing process. Alina felt the familiar tingle of danger she had learned to trust during her bounty hunting career. Hayes was lying. The red pins represented something he didn't want her to understand. I'd like to assist with the decoding process. I know my father's methods better than anyone. That won't be necessary. My cryptographers are highly skilled. Hayes returned to his desk and casually placed a stack of papers over Wyoming's eye. You've done enough. Time to let professionals handle the rest. Alina exchanged glances with Silas. He sat relaxed in his chair, apparently unconcerned by Hayes's evasions. Either he trusted his commander completely or he was better at hiding suspicion than she had given him credit for. A soldier will show you to quarters. Hot meals, clean beds, everything you need. Hayes moved toward his office door. I suggest you rest. You've both been through considerable hardship. Alina didn't move. I'd prefer to remain involved in the investigation. That's not possible. This is now a federal matter requiring security clearances you don't possess. Hayes opened his door and gestured for them to leave. Your part in this affair is finished, Miss Blackwell. The dismissal felt like a slap. Alina had carried her father's legacy for 3 years, risked her life to protect it, sacrificed everything to bring it to people who could act on the evidence. Now they wanted her to disappear quietly while others took credit for her father's work. Silas stood and approached Alina. The commander knows what he's doing. We should trust his judgment. Alina studied Silas's face. No tension around his eyes. No subtle signs of concern. Either he was genuinely at peace with Hayes's handling of the situation, or he was a better actor than she had realized. They followed a young corporal through the fort's corridors to guest quarters near the officers' mess. 2 rooms with clean beds and wash basins. Luxury after days in the desert. Alina's room contained a window overlooking the courtyard. She tested the latch and found it unlocked. Not quite a prisoner then, but the distinction felt academic. Get some rest. Silas paused in her doorway. Tomorrow, we'll start the process of clearing your name officially. Alina sat on the narrow bed and watched him disappear down the corridor. Alone for the first time since the Arrow attack, she tried to organize her thoughts. Hayes had taken Wyoming's eye with unseemly eagerness. He had blocked her view of the wall map and deflected her questions about the red pins. Most troubling, he had dismissed her from the investigation with the casual authority of someone accustomed to making inconvenient people disappear. Alina moved to her window and studied the fort's layout. Guard positions, patrol schedules, weaknesses in the perimeter. Old habits from a life spent hunting dangerous men. The sun set behind the western mountains, painting the adobe walls in shades of fire and shadow. Alina had survived 3 years as a bounty hunter by trusting her instincts. Those same instincts now screamed warnings she couldn't ignore. Something was wrong at Fort Esperanza. Hayes was not the honest Commander Silas believed him to be. The red pins on his map told a story he didn't want her to understand, and Wyoming's eye was no longer under her protection. Alina checked her weapons and counted her ammunition. Enough for a fight, but not a war. If she was right about Hayes, she would need to recover her father's legacy and escape the fort before dawn. If she was wrong, she would make herself a fugitive again for no reason. Either way, she couldn't afford to wait and find out which. The desert night settled over Fort Esperanza cold and still. Alina opened her window and listened to the sounds of military routine. Guard changes, Distant conversations, the soft footsteps of soldiers making their rounds. Somewhere in Hayes's office, Wyoming's eye waited on a desk surrounded by men who might be allies or enemies. Alina had spent 3 years learning to tell the difference. Time to trust that hard-won education. Alina slipped through her window at midnight when the guard patrols shifted positions. 3 years of tracking bounties had taught her to move through shadows without disturbing dust or creating sound. The fort's adobe walls still radiated heat from the day's sun, masking her body's warmth from casual observation. Hayes's office occupied the second floor of the command building. Alina scaled the outer wall using irregularities in the weathered adobe as handholds. Her fingers found purchase in mortar joints worn by desert wind and seasonal rain. The commander's window was latched but not locked. Military men often trusted walls more than glass. Alina eased it open and slipped inside. Wyoming's eye lay exactly where Hayes had left it, centered on his desk like a trophy. Alina pocketed the stone and examined the papers that had covered it. Maps showing weapon cache locations, correspondence with tribal leaders, financial records documenting payments for arms shipments, but the names were wrong. Every document bore Silas Callahan's signature. Alina's blood turned cold as understanding crashed over her. The red pins on Hayes's wall map marked successful weapons deliveries. The correspondence detailed coordination between federal marshals and hostile tribes. The financial records showed 3 years of systematic corruption. Silas wasn't investigating the arms-dealing operation. He was running it. Footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Alina moved to the window and found Hayes approaching with 2 armed soldiers. No time for stealth. She kicked out the glass and dropped to the courtyard below, landing hard on packed earth. Shouts erupted from the command building. Lanterns flared to life across the fort. Alina ran toward the stables as soldiers poured from their barracks in various states of dress and readiness. Her horse nickered softly as she entered its stall. Alina threw her saddle across its back and cinched the straps with practiced speed. Behind her, the fort exploded into organized chaos as Hayes coordinated the search. Alina led her horse toward the main gate. The guards there would be alert, but they wouldn't expect a direct approach. Sometimes the obvious path was the safest. The gate guards challenged her as she approached on foot, leading her mount casually. Official business. Commander Hayes needs these dispatches delivered to Rusted Gulch immediately. The young soldiers hesitated. Alina used their uncertainty to close the distance. When she was within arm's reach, she struck quickly and efficiently. Both guards dropped unconscious to the ground. Alina mounted and rode through the open gate into the desert night. Behind her, Hayes's voice bellowed orders for pursuit. Within minutes, a cavalry patrol would follow her trail by lamplight. But Alina knew the desert better than any four-trained soldier. She rode hard for the first hour, putting distance between herself and organized pursuit. Then she turned south toward Rusted Gulch, following game trails and dry creek beds that would mask her horse's hoofprints. Dawn found her in the same rocks where she and Silas had first observed the town. Rusted Gulch spread below her, peaceful in the morning light. Smoke rose from chimneys. Children played in dusty streets. Life continued unchanged despite the corruption festering at its heart. Alina studied Wyoming's eye in the growing light. Her father's carved symbols now made terrible sense. Not just evidence of Cortez's crimes, but proof that federal marshals were selling weapons to hostile tribes while pretending to investigate the trade. Silas had used her, fed her carefully crafted lies about being her father's partner, manipulated her trust to gain access to the one piece of evidence that could destroy his operation. But he had made one crucial mistake. He had taught her to care about justice again. Alina rode into Rusted Gulch as the church bells rang for Sunday service. Perfect timing. The entire town would be gathered in one place, including Cortez and whatever allies he had remaining. She dismounted in front of the white-painted church and tied her horse to the hitching post. Through stained glass windows, She heard the congregation singing hymns, voices raised in praise of virtues their leaders had abandoned. Alina pushed through the church doors during the final verse. Every head turned as she walked down the center aisle, her boots echoing on wooden floors. Families pressed together in their pews. Children stared wide-eyed at the infamous Alina Blackwell. Pastor Morrison stood at the pulpit, his face pale with recognition. Beside him in the front pew sat Jeremiah Cortez, dressed in the fine clothes of a successful businessman. Alina stopped in front of the altar and pulled Wyoming's eye from her pocket. 3 years ago, Marcus Blackwell died trying to expose the men who profit from frontier violence. Today, his daughter will finish what he started. Cortez half rose from his seat. This woman is a wanted criminal. Someone fetch the sheriff. Sheriff Morrison is already here. Alina let her gaze sweep the congregation. Sitting in the third pew with his family, pretending to be an honest man. Morrison stood slowly, his hand moving toward his concealed weapon, but Alina's rifle was already trained on him. The real criminals are federal marshals selling weapons to hostile tribes, men who hide behind badges while innocent families die in raids they orchestrated. Alina held up Wyoming's eye. My father encoded all their names, all their transactions, all their victims. The church erupted into confused murmurs. Cortez pushed toward the side door, but several townsmen blocked his path. 3 years of raids and violence had left everyone hungry for answers. Jeremiah Cortez is guilty of arms dealing, but he's not working alone. Marshal Silas Callahan runs the operation from Fort Esperanza with Commander Hayes's knowledge and approval. Alina began reading names from her father's decoded records. Victims of orchestrated raids, families destroyed by weapons sold through federal corruption, children who died so career criminals could profit from chaos. The church doors burst open as Silas entered with a patrol of cavalry soldiers. His marshal's badge caught the morning light streaming through stained glass windows. His rifle was drawn and ready. Alina Blackwell, you're under arrest for theft of federal evidence and assault on military personnel. Alina kept her own weapon trained on Morrison while addressing the congregation. Ask Marshal Callahan why his signature appears on weapons purchase orders. Ask him why tribes always know cavalry patrol schedules. Ask him why he really sought me out in the desert. Silas advanced down the aisle, his soldiers flanking him. Professional, efficient, men accustomed to following orders without questioning their morality. Your father was selling weapons to hostile tribes. He died because his partners discovered his treachery. Silas stopped 10 feet from Alina. Wyoming's eye contains evidence of his crimes, not proof of his innocence. Alina smiled coldly. Then you won't mind if Pastor Morrison reads the decoded records aloud. Let the congregation decide who's telling the truth. She tossed Wyoming's eye to the pastor, who caught it reflexively. Silas lunged forward, but Alina's rifle stopped him short. The first entry is dated 3 years ago. Marshal Silas Callahan receives payment for delivering 50 rifles to Comanche War Chief Running Bear. The weapons were used in a raid that killed 17 settlers, including women and children. Pastor Morrison's voice carried clearly through the silent church. Alina watched Silas's face as the truth emerged. No regret, no shame, only calculation about how to salvage his operation. The second entry documents coordination between Marshal Callahan and tribal leaders. Attack schedules, cavalry patrol routes, payment amounts for successful raids. The congregation began to understand. 3 years of violence and loss had been orchestrated by the men sworn to protect them. Neighbors turned to stare at Morrison with newfound hatred. Cortez found himself surrounded by angry townspeople. Alina kept her rifle trained on Silas. Every raid, every death, every family destroyed. Also, you could profit from both sides of the conflict. Silas raised his own weapon. Enough! The church exploded into chaos as Alina and Silas faced each other across the altar. Around them, the congregation scattered for cover while Morrison tried to restore order. But Alina wasn't looking at Silas anymore. She was remembering arrows flying through desert air, a stranger throwing himself between her and certain death, blood soaking into sand as he whispered her father's name. That moment had been real. Whatever else Silas had lied about, his willingness to die for her had been genuine. "You saved my life." Eleanor's voice cut through the chaos. "Why?" Silas lowered his rifle slightly. "Because some things matter more than staying alive." Eleanor nodded and lowered her own weapon. Around them, the townspeople of Rusted Gulch began the long process of dispensing justice to men who had betrayed their trust. Outside the church, desert wind scattered dust and tumbleweeds across empty streets. Eleanor mounted her horse and rode toward the horizon, Wyoming's eye once again hanging around her neck. Her father's work was finished. His killers had been exposed. His legacy would live in the stories told by survivors. Eleanor had learned to trust again, even when that trust led to betrayal. She had discovered that courage meant more than facing danger alone. It meant finding people worth protecting, causes worth fighting for, and truths worth preserving. The desert stretched endlessly before her, but Eleanor no longer rode through it as an exile. She carried her father's memory, her mother's love, and the hard-won knowledge that justice was possible even in a world built on lies. Behind her, the bells of Rusted Gulch rang out across the empty land, calling the faithful to worship and the guilty to judgment. And that is all to the story, for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. And if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.